of producers are now finding that it's quite a successful method of feeding pregnant ewes. So I've seen a lot of interest, even in good seasons, to use it as a bit of a area to just allow pastures and crops to grow a little bit further than we'd normally let them before we release ewes out. So it's becoming a good tool in good and bad seasons. But tonight's webinar is going to be focused on setup, nutrition, and some health problems that we often encounter in containment. So unfortunately, this has been quite a common theme over the last sort of 3 to 4 years. So we're looking at why you would contain stock. So the first side of containment we're looking at is these dry, dusty paddocks that you would have all seen around the place. So without having somewhere to move stock to, feeding in paddocks basically will reduce ground cover below a level that allows the paddocks to recover successfully when it does rain. So the first thing is to get these stock off the paddocks and give you an option of continuing to feed them if it makes sense cost-wise, rather than having to destock in a dry season. The other reason we contain is just because of the extra energy requirement to feed stock like this in a dry paddock versus when they're locked in a pen and aren't able to walk around. So we'll go through this later, but there's a substantial difference in feed requirements for stock that are walking around chasing feed versus those locked in a pen. So that's the major reasons why we contain. I'm going to go through some design things to think about if you're looking at setting up containment pens. But the first thing I want to point out is that a lot of people build these pens assuming they're going to use them, every couple of years when it's dry. Once they've put the pens in, I've found many producers end up using them for a variety of reasons. So thinking about where you're going to place them in a close location to your shearing shed, your yards, means that you can use them as holding pens before shearing, pens to put in new stock that you may have drenched or want to keep separate for health reasons before you let them back out onto the rest of your farm. They can be utilised for that. A lot of people will join in containment, maidens, just to have them in a smaller area. So when you're looking at the design of these pens, have a really good think about the other uses of the pens and where they should be located next to your other facilities. So I've got a couple of images up on the screen. On the left-hand side is a new containment pen that was, as you can see from this one, quite simple fencing. Doesn't have to be anything significant, just needs to be able to keep the ewes in, basically. On the right-hand side, we've got a sacrifice paddock. So a lot of producers in a dry year initially will just use a smaller paddock, and it's a good way, I guess, to try containment without spending a lot of money on infrastructure up front. The major issue with a larger area is that, as you can see in that paddock on the right, once the opening rains do hit, you'll get that really short green pick. And the problem, as you guys know, with sheep, if they're short green pick, even if you're providing them grain and hay, they'll always chase it around the paddock. So then you become in that situation where they're chasing short green pick rather than going to the feed that you've supplied. So when we look at pen size, we look at the minimum for ewes when they get into late pregnancy I work on is 10 square metres per ewe. For lambs in a feedlot, we work on more like 5 square metres per lamb. So yeah, for the ewes, I'd go closer to that 10 square metres. If you need to lamb in an area, which we will discuss a little bit later, you need to do a minimum of 20 square metres, and I'd prefer a much larger area than that. So yeah, for your pregnant ewes, I'd work on that 10 square metres. You can go slightly larger, but I wouldn't be fencing an area that's much larger than that, just because of that issue of feed growing in the pen. When you're looking at your site, you also need to think about things like neighbours, waterways, and also checking your local council for regulations of where you can build these containment pens. So that does vary from in different council districts. But yeah, basically, a fence and your feeding systems and water is all we're talking about in a containment pen. They can be dual purpose with a lamb feedlot, but there will be slightly different ration considerations, which we'll talk about as we go through. So when we look at feeding systems, there's many different ways to feed ewes in containment. So the image on the left is a total mixed ration. So it is a popular way to deliver feed to ewes, just because you can provide exactly the ingredients they require as far as an appropriate level of straw, hay and grain to meet their daily requirements. We'll talk about this further as we go through also, but the main difference when you're feedlotting lambs and containment feeding ewes is the level of roughage we incorporate in that ration for ewes. So with ewes, we're looking at a higher fibre diet that meets their daily energy requirements. So especially with single bearing ewes, good quality hay can make up quite a large portion of the ration. So when you look at that trough on the left, that's a very effective way of feeding ewes. The problem is the setup of this kind of system. So you're looking at having to purchase a mixer, a Keenan mixer wagon or other brands that's able to chop hay and do a total mixed ration. You could also put your minerals and other additives into that ration. So it's probably the most consistent way to feed stock in a pen, but comes at a high overhead cost, and depending on the size of your mixer can be relatively time consuming. And depending on how much your trough can hold, you can be out there feeding sort of every day or every second day. So that trough that you're looking at there has been manufactured using polybelt. So I've got a few other examples of troughs, but polybelt or conveyor bent up like that can work quite well. And you can see there that the stock in the pen on the right are able to put their head through into the trough. This particular containment area is being set up that you can actually let stock into the other pen through a laneway, so it can be accessed on both sides. The middle setup there and the right-hand side are your self-feeders, which a lot of people commence feeding ewes with self-feeders because many of you have self-feeders on farm. They can be portable, so you can move them in and out. The problem with self-feeders, they can be very good because you can fill them up, once a week. If you've got more of a lick feeder type design, you can control the grain to quite low levels. The problem with self-feeders with ewes in pens for a long period of time, they do often learn to sort of kick and bash the feeders and often manage to get more grain out than what you anticipate. So it is important to monitor carefully the amount of grain those ewes are consuming because you can end up with ewes that are very much over-conditioned in quite a short period of time if you lose track of how much they're consuming. So I'll go through some rations with you later, but the grain amounts can be relatively precise as far as meeting energy requirements. So it's important, if you do go for self-feeders, just to really keep track of what they're doing with them. So the third system I've got here is the picture on the left here is just a pen of ewes. These are basically in a fibre pen, so they'll have their hay and straw provided in the pen. Every second day they're let out into this other pen on the right, so all the gates lead into this main pen. The ewes are let out one mob at a time and trail feed the appropriate amount of grain in these quite simple troughs. So that's a good option. Quite low setup cost, obviously, because you've only got the one trough pen for the ewes, but relatively labour intensive as far as moving ewes in and out. Obviously, over a large period of time, they become fairly trained, so they'll walk out, line up there, consume the amount of grain. A couple of hours later, they move back to the pen. So yeah, that can work well. It's just obviously being there to put them in and out and ensure there's space for them all to line up. So I've got a couple more photos. So the top left-hand side, just stock on fibre, basically just having either hay rings, hay, the squares to sort of hold the hay in place, or, this is simply weld mesh put around a round bale just to stop huge wastage of that fibre. Bottom left there, that's just a simple conveyor belt trough made in a fence line. You can see the wastage of fibre there, but quite a cheap and relatively effective way to feed stock and getting the feed off the ground. Next to that one, we've got a shade cloth trough. So these can work quite well as well. That's just hemmed either side, wire fed through. You can just feed out in the middle of that shade cloth trough. The advantage of this, if you do get a weather event, the water will drain straight through the feed. Probably don't last as long though as the poly belt or conveyor that we see can last quite a long period of time. And top right there, we've just got the Keenan mixer. So, a relatively expensive setup to go into, but, can be used for feedlot mixers, containment feeding quite precisely. So yeah, I guess with clients that have been doing it for a long period of time, I'm finding people are upgrading to this kind of setup just because it gives you so much control over the ration. And I've got an example of a water trough there, which I'll touch on a bit later. So when we're looking at trough space and self-feeder space, in a pen, I generally like to stick to sort of that 200 to 250 ewes in a pen, and I do like to split them into class. So having them scanned up and feeding singles and twins separately is relatively important just because of the energy requirement difference between the classes. We'll touch on that as well with some example rations a little bit later. But when you're looking at self-feeder space, I like to work on 100 to 150 ewes per self-feeder, and that depends on how much of the ration you're providing with grain. So if it's a lowish portion, 300 to 400 grams of grain mix a day, you can push it out to 150 ewes. If you're, late pregnancy twins and they're up to that sort of 800 grams of grain a day, I'd prefer them to be closer to that 100 ewes per self-feeder, just because they're going to be accessing it more regularly. I'd also always recommend having a minimum of 2 self-feeders in a pen. So if you're only running 200 ewes, I'd still recommend the 2 self-feeders, just because you find in feedlots and with ewes, they do have that social structure where you'll have a couple of sheep that will always bully a tail away from a feeder. So you just want an option of a second feeder so that doesn't occur. With your trough spacing, the same theory applies. So if we're looking at ewes being provided only fed sort of once a day and having to consume the feed sort of within a couple of hours, then I'd recommend that 25 to 30 centimetres of single-sided trough space per ewe. So if the ewes can access double sides to the trough, that's sort of that 12.5 to 15 centimetres of double-sided trough space. If there's fully ad-lib feed provided, like the examples we've shown with the total mixed rations, you can take that down to sort of 10 to 15 centimetres per ewe, just because they'll be able to access over a 1 to 2 day period. They're not all rushing to line up next to each other at the same time. So it depends a little bit on your feeding mechanism. So the other important consideration is shade. So most people tend to use these containment pens, from midsummer through to autumn, just through that until that break comes. So often it can be the heat events. Joining in containment, you can have, those quite hot spells in January or even February. So shade is critical also in the pens. There's many different ways and many different price points you can incorporate shade into your pen. So the photo on the left is quite a professional. So shade cloth, similar to what's utilised in cattle feedlots north. This has been erected by the farmer. With this shade, you want it to run north to south, just so as the sun moves, you don't have the same area of the pen shaded. So if it's wet, it can dry out. So this covers quite a lot of pens, will last a long period of time. It's very heavy duty and, yeah, a very heavy structure that's been put up to hold it in place. So quite an effective way, and this is also used for a feedlot, so perfect for that situation as well. In the middle there, if you're lucky enough to live in an area with beautiful large trees like this, they can make very effective shade. Just ensure they're fenced off or meshed around, because sheep will kill a tree quite quickly in a pen due to boredom by barking it. So I've seen many places where they started with beautiful shade and the sheep have killed the trees, even just outside the pen where they can reach through and ring bark a tree. So that's something to be careful of. Far right's quite a simple structure. So leftover pipe, shade cloth purchased quite cheaply. It doesn't need to be a high structure. We don't generally need to be able to get under it. It's just for shade for the stock. So that can work quite well as well without huge overheads as far as erecting or buying the materials. The one on the left, so these have probably been quite popular lately just because of the availability of shuttles, half filled with water. They're quite secure in wind events. You can get heavy duty shade sails from Bunnings. They don't have to be much heavier duty than that. They can clip on and off, so that's the advantage. If it's wet or muddy or a huge wind event, you can pull them down very quickly. So, you know, these setups can work quite well for feedlots and for containment ewe pens. The structure on the right, this has been up for quite a long period of time, these pens. So you see they've planted the bush there in the centre, which can work really well for shade and shelter from wind. And then at the back there were just second-hand shed structures this producer got quite cheaply that they've erected in a heap of their pen. So that can work really well as well. So there's no limitation to what you can use for shade. And obviously, if you're putting up new pens, planting native bushes, trees, blue bush, salt bush works really well as far as shade and shelter in years to come. So the next consideration we have is water. So there was a lot of information around with water troughing about the minimum space for stock, but I don't find it a crucial part of providing water for the stock. The most important part of your water is that it's high flow and low volume works quite well. So we just need a high enough flow rate that when, you know, you imagine 200 or 250 of your ewes all going together and having a drink, we just need to make sure the water supply replenishes very quickly. So that's more crucial than trough space. These PVC pipe troughs shown have been quite useful, and a lot of people have put them in over the last 10 years, I guess. Yeah, many different ways to make up a framework. They can go on the fence. The benefit of them is that they hold low volumes of water. So in a feedlot or ewe containment pen, you do need to clean your water out relatively often, just because stock will stop drinking if the water has a dirty film on it, if it's too dirty, and if they stop drinking, they'll stop eating. So it will limit production or your ewes meeting their energy requirements. So with these, really easy to clean. You're not dumping a heap of water on the ground. Yeah, having import flow rate, it keeps some of the dust out, and obviously they're pretty cheap and easy for most people to make. So the other important part about water, which can definitely be a restriction when we look at some country where we don't have a lot of control over water quality, but we do prefer high quality water and low salt levels. So for pregnant ewes, I'd normally recommend below 5,000 ppm. You know, some pastoral country sheep begin to tolerate slightly higher, but you wouldn't want to go too much higher than that for pregnant stock. The other thing when you're setting up your water and feed is to have your water and feed at opposite sides of the pen. So whether it's a self feeder or trough setup, put the feed on one side and then put your water troughs on the other side, preferably on the low side of the pen, just because when we're cleaning waters out, or if there's a leak, you just don't want water running through the whole pen and muddying up that pen. So we'd prefer them that way around if possible. The reason we keep them apart is just because you don't want stock going from the feed mix straight to the water and putting that feed straight into your water trough and dirtying it up. So as I said, cleaning it sort of every day is relatively crucial, but if you can keep it clean in between, that's really handy. One other thing we haven't touched on is also just the slope of those pens. So when you're choosing your site for your containment lots, 2 to 4% is ideal as far as slope of that land. Obviously, you know, I've been around a lot of farms where it can become quite tricky to find a good spot that's close enough, not in a waterway, and correct slope. So we can go up to 6%. The problem with having an area that's too flat is if you do get a rain event, you know, often your ewes may be in there over an opening rain. The water won't drain off and the ewes will be standing in mud, which you will potentially have hoof issues or other sort of disease issues going on with that wet, damp environment. But once you get to too much slope, you'll start to have water running off too quickly and erosion and things like that. So yeah, that 2 to 4% or up to 6% works possibly the best. There are apps available on your phone if you're not good at assessing slope, that you can measure slope of your land. So probably something good to check before you start putting in a significant line of containment pens. The other consideration is stock moving around the pen. So as we've said, it's great to have it near your yard, sheds, not too far, but obviously not too close to where you're living. But yeah, also having laneways or the ability to move stock from yards to pens can make it quite easy to get them in and out. So just touching now on the nutrition components of having stock in containment. So as I briefly mentioned, when we look at feeding ewes, it is different to your feedlot lamb as far as when you look at a feedlot lamb, we're feeding them for a short period of time. So we're wanting quite a high component of their ration to be grain, to push growth rates as quickly as possible with a slight amount of roughage just to keep the rumen working effectively. With a pregnant ewe, the aim is to put them back out on the paddock as soon as we get that break. So we're wanting to keep them on a high roughage ration while also meeting their energy requirements. So we're looking, that's why the TMRs, you know, self-feeders with ad-lib, good quality hay and some straw can work well. But we're wanting to keep that roughage component up just to keep their system working effectively. And, you know, sheep being ruminants, they do have a high proportion of roughage, enables their rumen to work more effectively and then enables them to transition well back onto paddock feed once it rains. So I like to show this triangle just because I think, you know, often in nutrition people get hung up on the details of some of the smaller requirements, where the top parts there, the energy, protein and fibre of the ration are the three things you need to focus on first with your containment feeding of ewes. So energy is required. So energy we're measuring in megajoules per kilo, similar to calories you look at as a human to put weight on. So energy is clearly just the amount of feed or energy that animal requires to maintain its condition score. So sometimes we look at, you know, lighter ewes coming in that need a little bit more energy to pick up a condition score, or sometimes they've got a bit heavy over summer and we need to slightly drop them back quarter or half a condition score. But yeah, we're basically measuring out the energy required to keep that ewe where we want them to be. Protein is also required during pregnancy. So obviously that ewe is growing out either 1 or 2 lambs. It's important to look at the protein required for that young lamb's growth, but we also don't want to go too high in protein because you can have issues then with lambs getting too big, which then makes it difficult for the ewe to lamb them and without birthing difficulty. So that's important as well. And as I've touched on, fiber's crucial just to keep the rumen working effectively. So early in pregnancy, the rations can be quite high in fibre. As we go through, especially with twin-bearing ewes, it will become much more energy-dense grain-based just because the pure energy requirements get so high, we can't often provide all of it with just hay. So once you've worked out your ration on that side, it is worth considering your macro mineral requirements, so specifically calcium, magnesium, and often a little bit of salt, just because of the deficiencies with your grain. So we're looking at just keeping that ration balanced and providing the macro minerals that animal requires to lamb down effectively. So we'll discuss this a little bit further later as well. Vitamins, microminerals, if animals haven't had green feed for a long period of time, they definitely could have vitamin and micromineral deficiencies. So depending on their status, we can work out how crucial these other ingredients are going to be. So when we look at requirements, there's a lot of information now around. There's tables like this available on the web on what an animal needs. It changes significantly with frame size. So we talk about something called a standard reference weight of a ewe, which is their mature, non-pregnant, bare shorn weight when they're in condition score 3. So what we want to know is the actual reference weight of that ewe, and then depending on their day of pregnancy and whether they're singles or twins, we can determine how much energy they need to maintain their condition. So, we often find in a containment pen, you'll get some animals bullying others and getting a bit bigger and others getting lighter. So it is relatively important to keep track of condition scores through the containment period, especially if they're in there for a long period of time. Now, as you can see in the far right column here, we've got the energy requirements of a confinement-fed 50-kilo animal. When you compare that back to an animal in paddock conditions, you can see it is around that 2 megajoules difference for an animal to walk around a paddock, and with your twins there at the end, you can see that it's closer to 4 megajoules difference for that ewe to continue walking around the paddock. So that's one of the reasons why it is better to lock them up. When you look at paying for supplementary feed per unit of energy you're providing, if they're walking around and around a bare paddock or chasing green pick, that's where we can run into trouble with twin-bearing ewes. So I've got a couple of example rations here. Just to point out, I guess, the importance of working out whether you're feeding singles or twins. So I guess the way I look at it, if you're going to go to the effort of putting them into a pen and giving them relatively precise nutrition, you're better off to know what their requirement is so we can feed them exactly to maintain that condition score. So these are a couple of rations, 120 days using current sort of feed prices, which obviously are barley and hay, dropped back significantly from last year. So the single bearing ewe there is requiring 13 megajoules. This is a 60 kilo ewe, twin bearings 15 megajoules. So you can see there that single 36 cents per ewe per day. I'd be feeding them around the 300 grams of barley per day, 700 grams of wheaten hay and 500 grams of barley straw. So the reason we've got the 2 roughages in there is particularly last year, our hay was quite good quality feed. So if you put out ad lib hay and the rest of your grain through a self-feeder, you'd find that a ewe could easily get 15 to 16 megajoules of energy just out of the ad lib hay. So we often just use the straw. It's higher fibre. The ewe fills up, so they've got basically a heap of fibre in their rumen. They can't consume much more. So we utilise that to make sure they don't overconsume hay or grain. So yeah, by designing the rations with the appropriate straws and hays based on feed test information, we can quite accurately work out what these stock are going to consume. With your twin bearing ration there, so 38 cents per ewe per day, requiring a couple of megajoules extra than the singles. So they're going to get 580 grams of barley, 400 grams of wheat and hay, and then the rest of their ration is going to be provided in barley straw. And I've costed in a reasonable quality magnesium calcium supplement as well. Now the difference here is once we get to 150 days, so right on the point of lambing, these singles are needing nearly 16 megajoules, the twins are 18.35 megajoules. So the singles are 45 cents per ewe per day for that 550 grams of barley, 800 grams of wheat and hay, and 300 grams of barley straw. The twins, 53 cents per ewe per day. So an extra 8 cents a day to feed your twin bearing ewes, you know, hoping to successfully lamb down twins in a lot of cases. But yeah, that extra cost, if they're not split by singles and twins, it makes it really tricky to feed them accurately, but also you end up overfeeding and overspending on your singles. So they're going to consume a kilo of barley and then, you know, ad lib wheat and hay. At that point, they don't have much gut space, so they definitely need that energy dense barley, and their wheat and hay intake will be restricted. So just touching on a few health problems. So I often find when people first contain, you know, if you talk to people that have done it for 10 years, they'll tell you all of these issues. So I guess in my role, I prefer to point out the problems up front because, yeah, it just seems crazy if we all hit the same problems as each other. I think it's just, there's a lot of these things you can avoid with sort of management. So Campylobacter's been one, you know, especially some of the containment lots that popped up quite quickly this year post fires. Campylobacter is basically a bacterial infection. So it can affect ewes in late pregnancy if they're exposed to it in the first time in that later pregnancy. So it'll lead to late term abortions, stillbirths, or you've confined birthing of weak non-viable lambs. So a lot of people report, you know, early stillbirths in the containment period, or they put them out in the paddock and a week or two after see a lot of dead non-viable lambs on the ground before you thought they were due to lamb. So this can be prevented. So Coopers have a vaccine called Campyvax for this. They basically just need 2 doses 4 to 6 weeks apart around joining. So either sort of 4 to 6 weeks prior to joining and then at joining, or the first one at joining and then 4 to 6 weeks after when you take your rams out, you can give them the second shot. So especially maidens, ewe lambs you're joining that may not have been exposed to Campy throughout their life, if they're exposed during pregnancy, that's when you'll have the issue. So if your older ewes can pass it to the younger ewes, you'll see those problems. So yeah, anyone that's, you know, had a lower percent than they expected in maidens, it's probably worth investigating. The other one is coccidiosis. So this is common in feedlots and containment or anywhere where stock are fed in a smaller area or often on the ground. So it's caused by a coccidia parasite. It can live in the soil for quite a long period of time. So if you're using the pens for a feedlot and then containment ewes, you could easily pick it up. That can be controlled by Bovatex. So that's a feed additive that can be added to loose licks or in with your mix just to prevent that occurring. Pulpy kidney. So any situation where you're changing feeds, you can be exposed to pulpy kidney. So that's a simple 3-in-1 or 6-in-1 vaccination will protect you against pulpy kidney. So before you start to build up the feed, 7 to 10 days prior, if you give them a booster, that'll prevent it. And same thing as we go to let the ewes out of containment if they're going on to a lush feed or a major sort of feed change. Acidosis, so, we've said about some feed amounts here. Just important to introduce starchy feeds or high grain or, some full feed pellets gradually, just so that you don't get that sudden hit of starch and acidosis environment in the rumen. So, I find commonly people lose ewes in containment pens due to acidosis. The other one I've got there is metabolic disease. So especially for people that don't often supplementary feed and then start feeding, higher amounts of grains and hay in a poor season, your grains will be very calcium deficient and quite magnesium deficient, and often the stubbles are that they've come off of over summer or dry feeds as well. So just ensuring you've got a calcium supplement along with the grain, and also magnesium provided 4 to 6 weeks out from lambing. Hypocalcemia was a major issue last year with ewes coming out of containment, especially onto grazing cereals and calcium magnesium deficient feed. So metabolic disease, hypocalcemia or magnesium deficiency, and pregnancy toxemia can all look quite similar. So you'll have ewes, often your largest overweight ewes, going down prior to lambing, can be very frustrating. So pregnancy toxemia is a lack of energy, but quite common in over-conditioned twin-bearing ewes, especially if they're walked out too late towards lambing, and they purely run out of energy and just lay down, and they're pretty tough to get back up. So yeah, avoiding these things with appropriate mineral supplementation, but also just monitoring your condition score so that your singles are around that 3 and your twins, lamb down in around that 3.5 condition score. Prolapse can be dust, short tails, excess protein, and ewes staying longer than they potentially should in a containment pen, where we often seem to get some cases of prolapse, so that's one to watch as well. So just to finish up, just going to touch on briefly just letting stock out of containment. So, most people successfully can get them through, most of them through the containment period, but letting them out also needs to have just as careful consideration. So, the photo over on the right, it's a common scenario. They're getting close to lambing. We potentially don't have quite as much feed on offer as we'd like in the paddock. But, often you have to let them out anyway if you're wanting them to lamb down in the paddock. So I definitely want to go over 2 weeks before they're due to start lambing. I probably, especially if ewes need to walk a little bit further, I think you're better sticking off to that sort of 3 weeks out from lambing. Just because we've had some shorter gestations, if they're having to walk away, it can put a bit of stress and you can lose some to preg tox if they're too close to lambing. So also just ensuring they're full, so they've had their roughage, they've had their feed, walk them out to the paddock in the afternoon, and also just continuing to provide that containment ration for a week or more out in the paddock. If there is inadequate feed on offer to meet their energy requirements, obviously important to keep supplementing over lambing so they can access that feed. But yeah, I think especially last year with the early break, earlier this year, we had more issues with ewes chasing short green pick and running out of energy because they wouldn't go back to those rations. So it can be a difficult scenario. We also see things like breaks in the wool just because of the change in nutrition. So it is important to wean them off the feed as slowly as you've weaned them on, or a lot of people try and shear around the time ewes are going into containment so you don't have that break right in the middle of the wool staple. The pictures in the middle and on the left, this is a producer that didn't have enough feed on offer in the paddock for all of their ewes. So this can be very useful for early lambing ewes or areas that you don't always get a good break. They've got shade, they're a couple of acre pens, they've got their feed there in their self feeders, they've got ad lib hay, and they lambed very successfully at a high rate because they had a lot of different areas of shelter that they could go and lamb down. Small enough mobs, so, you know, keeping your twins to that 80 to 100 twin-bearing ewes can work really successfully as well, just to prevent mismothering, because obviously 80 to 100 twin-bearing ewes can be 160 to 200 potential lambs that can obviously get mixed up quite easily. So yeah, small, you know, this can be more effective than them chasing short green pick with no energy around a large paddock. So something to consider. So that's all I wanted to cover tonight, and hopefully I've given you a good insight into those health problems, you know, the basics of designing a ration, and also some of those setup things to consider as far as your slope, your trough space, your self-feeders or troughs, and some of those methods of feeding sheep successfully. But yeah, that's my details. If anyone's wanting any further assistance, feel free to give me a call or email. But yeah, I'll hand back to Paul now, and hopefully I've prompted some of you guys to ask me a few further questions on anything you want answered.
Thank you very much, Deb. That was a great presentation, extremely thorough. You got through quite a bit in just 40 minutes there. So I imagine people will have questions. So feel free to either type them in if you want to raise your hand, or if you just want to start asking, more than welcome. I just wanted to know, Deb, so I can understand the benefits to resting the land by having ewes in containment during drought. Do you think there are significant benefits of using the containment area for pregnant ewes and lambs during good times too?
Yeah, so as I said in the beginning, I think quite effective. I'm finding producers that built them thinking they'd only use them in the drought are using them every year now, probably just for a shorter period of time. So I think when you've got that break, as I said, they're just chasing that short green pick. Just getting them off the paddock for, you know, 3 to 5 weeks can just ensure when you put ewes out there, they've got higher quality feed and good amounts of feed on offer available to lamb onto.
Great. So Nicole asked a question. She said, if you are lambing in containment and using scrub areas only for the lambing period, can this still bring bark trees in that time?
Yeah, so I've probably found like a scrubby paddock similar to that photo. They're not overly like ring barking those smaller trees in a short period of time. But I think if you had, you know, 2 or 3 major gum trees, like I'd shown in that initial image, I'd probably be putting a fence or, you know, some weld mesh or something around them, because you may find they'll go for those if there's only a couple. But yeah, the real scrubby trees, I think there's quite a few, and there's often sticks and other bits and pieces. I haven't had a major issue in a short amount of time.
Did anyone else have any questions? This is a great opportunity to ask away. I have another question too, Deb. How hard is it for ewes that have always been fed on native veg for generations? How hard is it to get them to actually to feed in the containment area? Is it quite a complicated and like a frustrating process?
Yeah, so I think with self-feeders, it can be quite tricky to get sheep that haven't ever had a self-feeder to come over to it, and especially when you're trying to lock them down and limit consumption. So, you know, feeding out mixed rations in troughs or starting to trail feed initially to introduce stock to grain so that then you can have your self-feeder more open is probably a better way of introducing them onto those feeders. But yeah, I guess producers that know they're going to end up containment feeding year on year now generally will try and provide a little bit of grain over weaning just to introduce them or get them used to what they're going to eventually be fed out of. just to ensure. It's basically called neophobia. It's just fear of something new, basically. So yeah, it can, if you suddenly threw them in with a feeder, you'd struggle. Another way of overcoming that is to put some stock in there that have had a feeder before, so bought in ewes, some other young lambs, some pet lambs, anything, just to get them to show the other stock where they're going. But you definitely have to allow a lot more time.
Have you found many people in the arid lands are taking it on? Have you worked with many out there?
Yeah, so there's definitely been a lot more interest, potentially more so sending stock south to put on feed. I think just sometimes with freighting feed up and also water considerations. So as I said, if you don't have good water quality in a drought, it can be a tricky one. But yeah, I've definitely seen a few more people starting to put pens in and look at it in poor years of supplementary feeding. So yeah, I think something there's a fair bit of interest.
Benji asked the question. He said, you mentioned giving 3-in-1 or 6-in-1 when putting them on grain or adjusting feed. How important is it coming off the feed to give a booster?
Yeah, so most people would be giving their or if you're doing a solid sort of vaccination program, you'd be giving your pre-lamb booster sort of 4 weeks out from lambing anyway. So yeah, most people I'm working with would be giving that 3-in-1 or 6-in-1, yeah, 4 weeks prior to lambing, which often coincides to getting them out onto feed. So I definitely haven't seen an issue, but that's just because they're all vaccinated. If you're going, obviously if they're still going into a lambing pen where they're on similar sort of supplementary feed like that scrubby photo I showed, you're not going to have a serious change. But, when you're putting them back out onto lush feed or you have got a good break, I think it's worth that extra booster just to make sure. Just especially with ewes now, if you've spent all that money on them, a twin bearing ewe or even a single bearing ewe, it's not worth losing them at the end because of pulpy kidney.
Sam's asked, would adding molasses or even a urea lick to your feed ration be a good idea? And if so, at what sort of rates?
Yeah, I probably wouldn't overly, I'd probably look at those sort of things more as paddock supplementation methods. Just because if you've already got the ewes in, it's probably cheaper to add true protein like lupins or, peas or lentils or something to your grain rather than urea, just because urea will only give you a little bit of extra protein of non-protein nitrogen. So it can be a useful boost if you're on a high roughage ration in pastoral areas or in stubbles and things, but potentially not as useful in a pen to do that. And same as molasses, it'll give you a little bit of extra energy, but your barley is a cheaper form of energy than adding that slight extra amount of molasses. The only time I'd sort of add molasses or some sort of liquid is in those total mixed rations, especially if it starts getting a bit dusty. It can just help your feed smell better and also just have, more of a damper, less dusty sort of consistency.
Did anyone else want to jump in with a question? Well, give a little bit longer just in case somebody's thinking of one, but okay, Deb, I reckon, is there anything that people may think of asked you in the past? Anything that you'd like to add?
No, I think we've covered it relatively substantially. I guess just reinforcing potentially the biggest issues I have is just ewes within a pen in too big a group, and mixed singles and twins, or even with singles and twins, just where you end up with a portion of them just getting way too big or too light. So I guess just that, and that comes back to that statement about having it nearest to your yards. If they do end up in a containment pen for 3 months, 4 months, it is worth bringing them in and just doing a bit of a resort and just keeping track of your condition score. And if you haven't done condition scoring, or you're unsure about nutrition, a lifetime ewe course can be a great sort of start to get your head around how to monitor the condition of your stock and what you're aiming for as well. But yeah, thanks everyone for coming on. It's a busy time of year.
Thank you very much, Deb. And if people have more questions, they can give you a call. And this is part of your role. If people do want to take this on, you can help them through the process. And do you do that as part of your job? Is that, or do you have people?
Yeah, so provide sort of containment recommendations of feed rations for different mobs of stock. I'm also running a containment ewe project over 3 years, which MLA, it's an MLA producer demonstration site. So we've got 15 sites through the Barossa. We're following successes, failures, things like that. So if you keep up with that through Barossa Grazing Group, there's plenty of information coming out of that on containment feeding ewes as well.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who came.